All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel and we do educational videos based on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, tour de forces, and grand magnum opuses, grand unified theories, theories of everything, cosmologies, things that you can base everything in your life upon. And today is our 21st video that we've done on the book called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? And this is a history of two groups of relatively obscure jazz musicians in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s who articulated a cosmology that was quite different than what had preceded them, except not immediate, that had immediately preceded them. And we're about to start chapter 6, which is called The Creation of a World Music. Part 1, Introduction. The difficulties of spreading Black creative music became painfully evident to the AACM at the end of the 1960s. The deaths of inspirational jazz-free leaders Eric Dolphy, 1964, Albert Ayler, 1970, and especially John Coltrane, 1967, dealt a severe blow to the jazz-free movement. In Chicago, tragedy struck too, but when it did, it propelled the movement. Surviving musicians rushed forward to seize a heightened responsibility to make up for and transcend the loss. 23-year-old pianist Christopher Gaddy of Joseph Jarman's group passed in March 1968 of heart failure. Gaddy knew that his time was coming. Doctors offered him a transplant operation, but since Gaddy believed in the Hindu doctrines of karma and the transmigration of souls, he could not accept the operation. According to musicians within the AACM, the young pianist chose the time of his passing and accepted it calmly. In April 1969, however, the death of 24-year-old bassist Charles Clark, also of Jarman's band, came as a complete shock. Clark had a cerebral hemorrhage while waiting for the elevated train after a rehearsal for the Chicago Symphony. With Clark's death, the AACM re-intensified its mission to put the music back together again. The idea was first to put Black music together, then to put all music together, a new world music, summarized by Abrams. Quote, "One of the purposes of this music is to give the world a feeling, some information about ourselves, a spiritual message. It's a mission of sorts. Music finally has to be about all of humanity." After Clark's death, many felt a higher urgency because they were, quote, dying in Chicago. Considering the AACM as a whole, Smith believed that there was a feeling in the air that creative musicians had to take their message to the world before it was too late for all of them. Smith said that it was never spoken, but there was a non-verbal thing that we had to go. The next pages will chronicle some of these events that through worldwide presentation and petition turned the AACM into an internationally known organization. Section 2, the AACM in Europe. The death of Clark dismantled Jarman's band, and at first left Jarman deep in despair. But with the support of Mitchell, Bowie, and Favors, he began to see tragedy as a message to assert himself as a spiritual pioneer. Jarman began to rehearse consistently with Mitchell's band and took the lead in expanding the physical boundaries of the AACM's influence. Jarman's refuge in Mitchell's group eventually culminated in the formation of a new entity. It was formerly the Roscoe Mitchell Art Ensemble, but changed to the Art Ensemble when Mitchell renounced his leadership and it became a cooperative group. Jarman, Mitchell, Bowie, and Favors sought to pursue creative music missions with no nominal leader, or rather, with 4 potential leaders. The Art Ensemble changed its name again when it moved to Paris in 1969 to become the AACM's first international missionaries, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, AEC. In truth, the foundation for the AEC's mission had actually been laid much earlier. In 1967, drummer Steve McCall, one of the elder founders of the AACM, decided to move to Paris to see if he could create some musical opportunities there. McCall enjoyed some success in this regard, collaborating with New York expatriates Marion Brown and Bayard Lancaster. Initially, McCall sent home a letter or two saying that the ground was fertile in Paris, but at the time there was still plenty of activity for everyone in Chicago. No one was really ready to go yet, but his letters planted a seed. Later, Claude Delclou, a French drummer, became attracted to some of the early Delmarks and to McCall's own music. He contacted the AACM and invited any of the AACM groups, promising steady work upon arrival. This attractive venture, however, did not include traveling expenses. It was therefore beyond the means of Abrams and most AACM musicians. Lester Bowie of the Art Ensemble was an exception, however. Bowie, who was by this time also the AACM president, had made very good money as a studio musician for Chess Records and in other R&B gigs. His wife, Fontella Bass, was also commercially successful, having had a #1 hit, Rescue Me, in, I believe, 1965. After Clark's death, both of them stepped forward. According to Bass, not an official member of the AACM, it was time for her to make a sacrifice for the music and for her husband's group. They sold most everything they owned to finance the trip for them, their 2 children, the rest of the Art Ensemble, and their instruments. Bass's and Bowie's sacrifice cannot be taken for granted given the economic climate for musicians. For example, at first, drummer Philip Wilson was rehearsing with the Art Ensemble band, but he could not accept that kind of long-term financial sacrifice, especially when he was offered a lucrative contract to play rock and roll in the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, with whom Wilson played at Woodstock and other large countercultural festivals. There were no long-term hard feelings between Wilson and the band, because playing rock and roll was a sure thing compared to the in-the-dark venture to France. The departure of the drummer could have been crippling for the AEC, but with the ethic of multi-instrumentalism, they rebounded better than ever. Without a drummer, it was up to all the members to provide percussive sounds. The Art Ensemble was only 4 strong, but nonetheless, they went with Abrams' ideas of a creative orchestra in mind. For the mission, they shipped an arsenal of nonviolent weapons, several hundred musical instruments that weighed over 2 tons to Paris. As AACM co-founder and leader, Abrams gave his blessing, but he was committed to staying in Chicago and building a firmer foundation. Still, Abrams knew that the AACM was always for a world audience. The missionaries of the AACM were young musicians whose lives were radically changed again by the experience, and who radically expanded the scope of creative music through the European mission. Passing the torch in a farewell to Chicago concert, They reminded the other AACM members that, quote, America is in your hands now. The AAC were the latest in a long line of black performers to try to win over French urban audiences. Black musicians had a history in Paris dating back to World War I. From James Reese Europe to Sidney Bechet to Josephine Baker, Coleman Hawkins, Johnny Griffin, and Nina Simone, African American musicians have chosen to live and work in Paris, where they were appreciated on a level unfathomable to domestic black musicians. Mitchell had been stationed in Germany with the army, but it is clear that these musicians had never before experienced such a lack of racism as they did in Paris. Racism was there, only in a diluted form, less intense because it was not such a part of the landscape. Ironically, the Paris experience also exposed the AEC to New York musicians, which opened future opportunities for collaboration and the spread of creative music there. Upon their arrival in May 1969, the art ensemble was an instant success, a hit with fans and critics alike. They immediately secured regular work at the Théâtre de Lucenaire. They received acclaim from the journal Actuel, and they recorded 4 albums within the first month in Paris. Within a year, the AAC had recorded an additional 12 albums on various European labels. They had done the music for 2 soundtracks and had played in a movie themselves. Paris audiences were fascinated by their theatricality, their appearance, and their multi-instrumentalism. The AEC rented a residence and rehearsal space at a house in the suburbs. They acquired a number of trucks for transporting their instruments and a couple of guard dogs to watch over them. For a time, according to Bowie, they were even in the business of renting trucks. The group's good fortune in Europe came naturally as an outgrowth of their experiences with the AACM. Unbeknownst to the Paris audiences, there was quite a bit of preparation and planning that went on behind the scenes which ensured success. Jarman spoke of, quote, being successful in the moment with what you're doing right now and what you're practicing and what you're studying, what you're performing in front of an audience right now. Jarman's outlook reflected the AAC's strategy behind every performance, presentation, where hours of practice and preparation in every facet required everyone's all. For example, it took them 2 hours just to set up their instruments for a public presentation. Moreover, for years before Paris, the art ensemble members had taken frequent long road trips, and they knew that the most important thing on such missions was to stick together, not to let individualism ever come before the music of the group. From the start, the AACM, or the AEC/AACM, went to Paris with a belief in presenting themselves as a unified group to convince listeners to participate in the creative force of great black music, ancient to the future. They believed in participatory leadership as diplomats, presentation, and missionaries, petition, of black creative music. Another important factor in the AEC's trip was that members of the AEC all had military experience, lest any one individual be tempted to liken the trip to a vacation instead of a mission. With their initial success, they were anxious to let their compatriots stateside know of the scene that was developing. Anthony Braxton, Leo Smith, and Leroy Jenkins had already been preparing for Europe, having decided they were ready for foreign creative presentation and petition. The news only bolstered their confidence. The 3 had been playing together consistently and decided to come over as a cooperative unit, the Creative Construction Company, CCC. Jenkins gave up a good job teaching for the Chicago school system, and he and Smith took a boat to Paris in June 1969. Braxton got a head start by plane. In the taxi from the airport to the city, Braxton fortuitously spotted Steve McCall, who was interested in rehearsing with the CCC. McCall fit in well, and the quartet began presenting creative music in Paris to equally enthusiastic, if not as uniformly positive, reactions as the AEC. Reportedly, at one show, there was a riot. At another, the musicians were pelted with mud. Braxton recalls that, quote, "We had a lot of concerts where the audience at some point would take over, half liking it, half hating it. Some of the reactions may have had to do with expectations." Braxton reports that the crowds did not like him because he did not sound like Roscoe Mitchell. According to Leroy Jenkins, the response was, quote, "negatively positive." "They would come out to boo us," he claimed. "They were actually throwing stuff at us. We started playing back at them. It was a fight between us and the audience. Me and Braxton and Leo and Steve got up there and fought the audience back with our horns." Even though presentations did not always go well for the CCC, the reactions showed that the audiences were at least paying attention. The musicians were struck by how serious the French were about black music and culture in general. Jenkins, for example, was astounded to find out that audiences already knew who he was before he even played a note. As the AECM would discover, this high value given to black music as a cultural resource was evident throughout Europe. African American music was a cultural import to Europeans, and many of the governments operated halls and theaters whose function was to provide their citizens with usually free cultural performances. While this state of affairs was excellent for the AECM in terms of presenting the music, it actually made it more difficult to petition the audience. Because of government involvement, these performances often were seen implicitly by the audience as secular functions. This may not have been what the AECM had in mind in terms of ritual, but it definitely showed potential. The musicians had creatively presented their music, even if a full petition seemed a long way off. The CCC played in Paris for about a year, but then they broke up and headed back to the States. The short-term fortunes of the CCC may have had to do with their lack of preparedness compared with the AEC, and more particularly with the fact that they did not stick together. Braxton, for example, got disgruntled with the French when they wouldn't give his written compositional work as much credibility as his saxophone playing. He saw it as a subtle form of racism. These issues may have detracted from the group as a whole. Braxton longed for New York, where he felt his compositions would receive a hearing. In 1970, things also stopped going so smoothly for the Art Ensemble of Chicago and Paris. First, according to Scott Horeha, they did not get fully compensated by the BYG record company for several of the 1969 recording dates. Like the ESP deal in New York, they got into a contract where they were not given royalties. In 1970, the AEC also became a quintet when it adopted drummer Don Moyer, a native of Rochester, New York. He began to work very well with the band, and he joined them and the AECM in June 1970. While by all accounts Moyer was a positive development toward creative music for the AEC, their dynamic shifted because of him, which, as others have pointed out, may have affected their acceptance by French audiences. Horeha argued that the AEC's downfall in Paris was related to the addition of a drummer, because without the chamber music quality of the drummerless group, European audiences could not relate. Rea made this argument convincingly, but he attributed their pre-Moye rhythm to mostly European elements, ignoring the fact that even before they got a real drummer, the musicians all had African-centered conceptions of rhythm. It is important to point out that at all times, drummer or no, the AEC was reflecting African-American forms of rhythm, even if European audiences thought it was chamber music. It was not. Rea overestimates the amount the AEC's music contributed to their downfall. The addition of a drummer brought the AEC much closer in appearance to what commentators might call Black nationalism, and that likely played a more decisive role. In 1970 Paris, the AEC's problems were not as much musical or financial as socio-political. In August 1970, the AEC had to leave Paris because they were kicked out. Reportedly, a local radio announcer linked the AEC's music to that of the Black Panthers in America. One of the established politicians in town heard the broadcast and the next day sent the police to the AEC's suburban home and pressured them to leave. According to Bowie, the AEC told him they were about to leave anyway, and they complied with the mandate. Said Bowie, quote, "We're the only musicians talking about the unity of mankind, and we got shot down as being race haters." When they left Paris, they traveled in 2 trucks with their instruments, patrolled by guard dogs. They presented all over the countryside of France, Belgium, and Germany for several months, camping at night and cooking their own food, bypassing many of the same problems that had historically crippled Black bands in America: no direct control over itineraries and programs. Hospitality from the audience got them frequent nights of free lodging. The military and the AECM discipline helped enable the AEC to thrive in a situation that would have caused other bands to break up. As Mitchell remembered, they really take the AECM for granted now in Europe. People don't realize what happened to create that situation. We were sleeping on people's floors, but we actually created a scene there. Eventually, the AEC decided its work was done and decided to go back to Chicago, regroup, and prepare for future missions. The CCC returned to the States in mid-1970, while the Art Ensemble followed in early 1971. They all returned as AACM heroes because they had successfully presented Black creative music to audiences in Europe. These early years in Paris were a litmus test for creative music. They presented the music and prepared the groundwork for eventual petition. The Paris missionaries set the tone for the AECM's approach to, quote, the forming of a world music. After a brief trip back to Chicago, the next conquest was New York for Jenkins, Smith, Braxton, and McCall. For their first CCC presentation in New York, they also invited Muhal Richard Abrams and bassist Richard Davis to make it a sextet. The CCC gave a series of presentations in New York loft spaces, giving birth to the jazz-free loft movement in New York. In general, however, the few opportunities existed to present the music, not to mention petition the audience. New York would be their toughest test. AACM musicians often stayed away from New York during the early 70s, preferring smaller American cities where there wasn't such a heavy jazz infrastructure. Since the AACM was not a short-term operation, initial failures in petition did not jeopardize the group. Eventually, their perseverance would inevitably pay off, they thought. There was clearly a sense of achievement back home for the AAC's accomplishments and an endorsement of pro-travel consciousness. The idea that Black musicians could, by traveling, create opportunities. Following the AAC and CCC, many AACM musicians began to work pursuant to this theory. Upon returning to Chicago, the AAC headed for St. Louis to take advantage of the formation of the Black Artist Groups, BAG. BAG was an offshoot of the AACM, which, through a state grant, had established a headquarters that became the site for many a sunrise concert after all-night practice sessions. One other reason, however, that they stayed at the BAG building was that they couldn't afford to play and live in Chicago or anywhere else in America. The early 70s were a nadir for the jazz economy, especially for free musicians. The white audiences were drawn in by rock and roll, and this included many jazz critics. Downbeat, in fact, began to devote a large percentage of its space to covering rock and the new breed, jazz rock fusion. Starting with John Hammond, social critics began to feel that rock more represented their dissenting cool attitude. Black audiences ever since World War II had been drawn to a music with a steadier beat and themes about love. Moreover, after proving themselves in Europe, the musicians in the AEC were no longer content to play gigs in Chicago to support themselves. American reality slapped them in the face when it became apparent that their home country was the worst place for a Black creative musician, and that more travel would be necessary. Still optimistic, they figured time was on their side. They had made their reputation in Europe, and eventually people would come looking for them. One set of American institutions that did come looking for them was academia. At first, even the most skeptical musicians hoped that an opportunity to teach mostly affluent white college students was a real opportunity to get creative music established throughout America, but they knew it would not be easy. Roscoe Mitchell, for example, accepted an appointment to teach at the University of Wisconsin, but in general, these opportunities were laced with shortcomings. Even when they did get opportunities, they often found they were setting themselves up to be contained. Braxton argued, so there's an advantage connected with the university in some part, like where you can make some money and use the facility and teach, but if you stay there too long, it can also become a disadvantage. He added that a seemingly good job could turn out to stifle creativity. Quote, when you think it's happening, what you find is mostly that you've instead got a more sophisticated method of control. In the 1970s and 80s, the AACM needed to revise its strategies to adjust to a changing field of representation and repetition. Mitchell, in accepting a university appointment, did not leave the AEC. The members of the band had developed a changing ethic for group longevity. They agreed to spend a certain amount of time together, but also a certain amount of time working individually on outside projects. The group was still close. Many of the side projects turned out to be projects with each other in diverse combinations. When they did get together to create and rehearse, they treated it like a training camp, renting a house in an out-of-the-way place to focus on nothing but AEC music. The remaining sections of this chapter will ask more questions than they answer. Rather than pretend that this is some kind of comprehensive examination of the AECM, it will be telling a particular story, hopefully pointing to areas for further study. More important, it will develop the center thread that connects the different stories. The idea that the AACM pursued a mission which was to present and petition audiences so as to spread Black creative music as a worldwide spiritual force for higher consciousness. Stories, examples, anecdotes, vignettes, and excerpts will be chosen that demonstrate particular points about the expansion of creative music and its reception. Certainly, people could find counterexamples, but in many cases they would prove the rule. The examples are given only to show a general trajectory of experience for a large group of musicians. Such an approach might compel a focused concentration on individuals, but as far as the AACM was concerned, quote, it was group music. Okay, we're going to stop it right there. The next section is called The Next Generation in Chicago. And we'll pick up tomorrow at that point and go from there. All right, thank you for tuning in today. Also, if you'd like a discography of all the great music that came out in this history, just Cash App or Venmo me $1 or more, and I'll send you out a discography. That way you can support these musicians by buying some of their records. You know, the ones in the discography will be, you know, records from this time period. But many of these musicians are still alive and making music in the present tense. So you can also look to support them that way. Okay, thank you for tuning in today.